Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Jen Beer, Vice President of Government Affairs at the Allegheny Conference and its Greater Pittsburgh Chamber of Commerce affiliate. Welcome to the latest installment of the conference's Response and Recovery webinar series. Before we dive into our programming, I want to thank our sponsors for their generous support that makes all of this possible: Peoples, Giant Eagle, Highmark Health, and UPMC Health Plan. I'd also like to thank members of the Allegheny Conference's Regional Investors Council for their time, talent, and resources in support of the conference's work on behalf of the region. Today's webinar will focus on coming off of COVID-19 and Pennsylvania's fiscal outlook on the other side of a global pandemic. Our guest presenters will be Matt Knittel, Director of Pennsylvania's Independent Fiscal Office, and Kevin Pawlos, Director in the Office of Management and Budget for the City of Pittsburgh. The dramatic impact on near-term economic growth for Pennsylvania as a result of COVID-19 mitigation efforts is central to the fiscal outlook detailed in the IFO's report. Programs such as transportation and infrastructure, community development, education, housing, unemployment, almost any line item in Pennsylvania's budget all stand to be impacted by the unprecedented economic upending that resulted from the COVID-19 mitigation efforts. So the big question, one that Matt will tee up and one that he and Kevin will help to aim answer, is what bearing this could have on the state and the Pittsburgh region. Moving forward has probably never been more important nor more challenging in some regards. But before I turn it over to Matt, just a reminder that you may feel free to submit questions through the Q&A function. And so with that said, I am pleased to turn over the program to our first speaker, Matt Knittel. Welcome, Matt.
Hi, Jen. How are you? Thank you for having me on the conference today. Just a few things before we begin the presentation. What you'll see is a presentation that we posted to our website on June 22nd, so earlier this month. It's still out there for those who are interested. And what this is, it's a projection of the general fund revenues that the state will receive next year, and also the economic conditions that will motivate those revenues. And we do this analysis and projection every June, and then we'll update it again in November and then again in January. And what you'll see here is that I do have 20 slides that I'll work through. I won't comment on all of them, and I'll move through quickly to reserve time for questions and the other presenter. But again, it is posted to our website for those who are interested. So with that, if we could move to the first slide, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on all of these, but what you'll recall, and it seems like a long time ago, was that before the pandemic hit, the economic growth in the state was very solid. And here on this slide, we look at the growth in the last 4 quarters, and I'll just touch on the far right column, which is the year-over-year growth rate in the first quarter of 2020. And some we had data for, some we did not. But you'll see the statewide wage growth was at about 3.7% on a year-over-year basis, which is quite strong. That's a good growth rate. Our net jobs creation was about 51,000 jobs, and that's on an annualized basis. It's not just for the quarter. Home sales were doing quite well. Year over year, they were up about 6%. So the housing market was holding up well. And then even consumers, the data suggests that they weren't overextended. The consumer debt was growing by about 3.8% year over year. So things were very solid. The labor market was doing well. The housing market was doing well. And our revenues for the state, we were running about $165 million over estimate, which is a little under 1% through the month of March. Next slide, please. We'll skip by this one. This is just a timeline. We'll go to the next slide. So on the next slide, we have our forecast for the state for 2020 and 2021. And down below, we compare that to the Great Recession. And just a caveat, I know a lot of comparisons are made to the Great Recession. It's useful to do so, but the economic conditions this time are just very different. And I'll touch on that a little bit in a presentation. But just in the top half of the slide for this year, we have projected real GDP growth of negative 5.6%. Wages falling by 3.2, and a jobs contraction of about 453,000 jobs. That's an average for the entire year. and that's roughly an 8% contraction. For next year, you can see we have a bounce back, and I would say that my office is assuming a type of V-shaped recovery. We are assuming things bounce back relatively quickly. I think we're starting to see some of that, but we have some concerns with a little uptick in the virus infection rate. On the net jobs, you'll see we have them bouncing back by about 310,000. What you don't see here, however, is that in 2021, we do think there will be about 170,000 fewer jobs compared to 2019. So that is, even going forward, we think there's going to be some permanent job loss here. Much of it will be lower wage workers in the retail sector or the food service and accommodation sector. And we don't think a lot of those jobs will come back in the near term. Down at the bottom, just a few words. I'll focus on the net job loss in 2009. You'll see that it was a contraction of 184,000. So you'll see the very large differential in the jobs contraction for COVID-19 versus the Great Recession, much larger. And then for the Great Recession, if you look over the 3 years, 2008 to 2010, it hit in all 3 years, whereas now we have, again, more of a V-shaped and a bounce back in 2021. Next slide, please. So here are just some national forecasts. For the US, I won't spend a lot of time on these. The thing I'll call out is that the top bank of numbers from IHS Markit, you'll see the jobs contraction in 2020 of negative 13.5. Down below that, we have the forecast from the Congressional Budget Office, negative 9.4. And I just noted that the IFO forecast for Pennsylvania was at negative 8. So I'd say we are a little more optimistic than most of the national forecasts, but so far I think the data are supporting our outlook. Next slide, please. One of the things I think is underappreciated and is driving the better outlook than we had assumed is there's a very large injection of federal monies that are flowing into the state. And on this slide, we try to quantify how much monies are indeed flowing in. And to the top left, you'll see the monies flowing in from unemployment compensation and other stimulus. The top line of the economic impact statements, these are the $1,200 or the $2,400 per taxpayer that are flowing into Pennsylvania. That number is largely known. It was about $10.8 billion. Then below, we have the additional state unemployment compensation payments and the federal unemployment compensation payments. In particular, the very large federal UC piece at $14.7 billion. That's probably a little higher now by a few $1 billion, but again, a very large amount. Down below that are the business provisions. So we had some business tax cuts that we think were worth about $4.6 billion. Those are federal tax cuts. We have a large delay in employer payroll taxes that are getting shifted out to next year in 2022 of about $10.8 billion. And then the PPP forgivable loans, we think is about $20.5 billion. To the right, we have the federal grants and state and local grants that are flowing into the state. And then the bottom line total currently is $78.7 billion flowing into the state. And that does not assume that another stimulus package will be enacted heading into the fall. I think that's more likely now, so that this number would, of course, increase if that does indeed take place. Next slide, please. Just a quick note, I had discussed the federal payments, and one of those programs is the FPUC payments. This is the extra $600 per week that is received. Ordinarily, and I won't cover all the material on the slide, if we have a worker who's making $12 an hour, that extra $600 translates into a wage replacement rate of about 175%. We're also seeing a lot of part-time workers and gig workers that are filing that are also receiving this extra $600 a week. And then down below at the bottom of the slide, you can see how that translates. And these numbers right now, based on the latest data, would be a little higher. So instead of 11.5 billion, it's probably closer to 12 or 13 billion. And that equates to about $800 million per week being injected into the state economy. So really about $3 to $3.5 billion from these extra $600 payments per week flowing into the state. And one of the concerns we have, and I think this is underappreciated, these payments will end middle to end of July, and they're so large that I do think it will move the needle on things, and we'll see a slowdown in the economic activity. Next slide, please. On the next slide, we have the latest data from the employment picture, both for the US, that's on the left part, and then for Pennsylvania on the right part. And these are the year-over-year contraction in the number of jobs. Just a few notes on this slide. So you can see for Pennsylvania, that top line number, we contracted by 17.5% and 14.4% in May. And those numbers are generally a little larger than the US because the mandated business closures were a little more comprehensive in the state. I'll just call out a few sectors. The construction sector for PA, the second line, you can see the very large contraction in April, but we had a nice pickup in May, less of a contraction as these opened up. Going down the slide, about 2/3 down, you can see the two sectors that were hit hardest. Arts and entertainment, so these are bowling alleys or gaming or theaters, a 55.8% contraction, and then accommodation food service, of course, at 51.3%. Next slide. So on this slide, we look at the same data. We're just drilling down a little further. And instead of looking at sectors, we look at subsectors. And I'll just focus on Pennsylvania to the right. So full service restaurants, we had a jobs contraction of about 2/3 at 65%. Amusements and gaming, again, these are bowling alleys and theaters and casinos, about 60%. Personal care and laundry, dry cleaning, these are barbers and nail salons, 56%. Childcare, it was down 43, but now it's only down 28% in May. And then employment services, so these are temporary help agencies, down about 1/4. At the bottom of the slide, you can see pretty much the only two subsectors that came out of this unscathed, couriers and messengers. So this is FedEx and UPS. So the employment is up by 6.7. And then finally, the federal government, we do have an expansion largely due to the temporary census workers that are employed. Next slide. Here we have just an overall snapshot across the latest 2 years and then our projection for 2020. So you can see in terms of payroll jobs, in a normal year, Pennsylvania is generating anywhere between 55,000 and 70,000 jobs. For this year, we have a projection of a negative 453,000. And the job losses are, where you thought they would be, mainly in the food service sector at 134,000. And then if you go up to the top of the slide, the third line, we have a contraction of 70,000 in wholesale retail. But if you look over the last 3 years, there was a contraction already underway. So we think the COVID-19 is accelerating a lot of these trends that would have otherwise occurred due to e-commerce shopping. And again, my suspicion is that a lot of these jobs will not be replaced. They won't be coming back. One other thing to note on this slide, these are only payroll jobs, so they don't include independent contractors or tech workers or gig economy workers. Next slide, please. One note, we've been talking about wages and jobs. On this slide, for the purpose of our forecast, of course, we have to project other non-wage income, things such as net profits and capital gains and dividends. And of course, in a normal year, it's difficult to forecast these income sources. And I'll just note, this is what we have built in for our forecast for 2020, about a 15 to 20% contraction. The thing that's very unusual right now, if you look at the bottom line, is that there's a disconnect currently with the stock market. The stock market's holding up very well. It had a very good second quarter. So I'm not sure going forward if that will hold up, but we do think these other income sources will decline in 2020. Next slide. Earlier I had noted that we have a jobs contraction, and on average it was about a negative 450,000 for the year. This is a snapshot of how that would look over the quarters going forward. And I'll just draw your attention to the final column. We do have a quasi-permanent loss of 170,000 jobs, even in the first quarter of next year. Again, a lot of that is retail sector jobs or food service sector jobs. that we don't think will be recouped in the near term. I do think that we have some serious structural changes that are taking place currently. And we do have a lot of concern that even over a 2 or 3 year period, whether those jobs will be replaced. Next slide. And I'll skip over this one. Larry, if you can go to the next one. So here we have our forecast for the state. These are general fund revenues for the current fiscal year. We had originally forecast $35.5 billion. We then take our changes to the forecast and we put them into 3 buckets. One is the non-COVID impact. This is what was occurring through March of this year before the pandemic hit. Then we have a lot of shifting going on, monies that are kicked off to next fiscal year that will collect about $2 billion. And then finally, what we think the impact is from the virus at $1.7 billion. Our overall forecast over at the far right is $32 billion. So we do have a reduction of about 2.5% for this fiscal year. And down below, we have the detail, and I'll bypass that and save it for the end in case anybody's interested. Next slide. We'll skip this one and go to the next one, Larry. So one of the things that's very surprising to us right now is our sales tax revenues. They are holding up very well despite about 1 million people being unemployed. And we think the reason for this is largely due to the federal injections of monies that are coming in. Just to give you some appreciation for this, if you look at the middle part of this slide, our motor vehicle collections were down in April. These are car sales by about 89%. In May, they were down 62%. But for the month of June, that figure is now up by 28.5. So tax revenues from car sales are actually up year over year in June. Some of that is pent up demand, but some of that is these extra monies flowing into the state. For non-motor vehicle collections, so this is everything else, you can see they were down by about 20 to 25% in April and May. However, for the month of June, they're almost flat from last year. So we didn't have a drop off at all. Very surprising that these are holding up so well. And again, we're attributing this to the extra unemployment monies that are flowing into the state. And down at the bottom of the slide, we just note that we have real concerns what happens when this program ends and these monies are no longer being received. We also don't have a good idea of the mortgage and rent payments that are in arrears. Next slide. This is our forecast for next year. I won't spend a lot of time on this. We have a forecast of $33.9 billion. It's a drop off of 0.7%. And Larry will just keep moving through. One thing I'll just note that's interesting is the lottery, the Pennsylvania lottery. We have data here on the sales through April. These are actual data. So you can see for the lottery, the sales were down 14%. And here we have the different types of games. The one that did well was iLottery, of course. So people are migrating online to play iLottery. However, we had a very different pattern in May. When we hit May, the instant ticket sales went up by 30%. And then we had some gains in the other games as well. So once again, we think this is due to the FPUC program, the extra $600 a month, per week. The timing lines up pretty well with it. And we do think we're seeing a kick not only in the lottery, but our sales tax collections. We'll just move through, Larry. We'll bypass this. And this one as well, motor license fund. I can talk about that, but I'll skip by it. So I'll just wrap up here and just a few takeaways. I'd say that we have a pretty good idea on the initial impact of the COVID-19. We think about 1.1 to 1 million job loss year over year. It's starting to recover from that. What we don't have a good idea on is what the shape and the pace of the recovery will look like. We do have some concerns at the end of July when this FPUC program ends and what that implies for the state economy. And then finally, we do have some concerns going forward, even though we assume a V-shaped recovery, how many of these job losses are permanent? And we do think some of them are permanent, in particular in the retail sector and the food service accommodation sector. And with that, I'll conclude. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. We really appreciate you walking us through those numbers. Very insightful, though maybe a little bit daunting. Before I turn it over to Kevin, just a reminder to the attendees that you may use the Q&A function at the bottom if you have a question for our panelists, and we'll get to those after Kevin Pawlos, which I will turn it over to now. Kevin, again, with the City of Pittsburgh, here to give us kind of the local angle and how these numbers might affect our city and our region. So take it away, Kevin.
Good morning, everyone. That was a great overview of the conditions up until now for the region. Just to give a little overview on myself, I've been with the City of Pittsburgh for 7 years. I'm new to the director role, stepped into that role September of last year. So quite a daunting task for your first year as a director. But my department is in charge of creating the operating and capital budgets. We work closely with the Department of Finance, who handles all of the revenue forecasts and collections. So there is a bit of a separation, but we do work closely with them. So the goal of what I'm going to talk about is kind of just what we are seeing from the city level thus far and maybe into the future with some of our outlooks and the steps we have taken up until now to try to reduce expenditures to help prepare for falling short of revenues and specifically talk about the budget process and whatnot. First, our latest revenue estimates show the city operating in a deficit of about $45 million. That's what we published in our first quarterly report. The challenge has been to try to estimate just how much that deficit will be, though, because we know that that $45 million is extremely fluid and could change weekly, daily, monthly. Much like Matt talked to, we do expect to see a rebound. It's just a matter of when. We originally thought the rebound would begin in the third quarter. Now with the recent spike in cases, that may be pushed back to 2021 or even 2022. However, we're fortunate that the biggest revenue category, real estate, has been collected at 80%, over 80% of our budget up until this point. Most of those collections come in the first quarter, and they're mainly from the mortgage companies. But the biggest revenue categories that we think that are going to be most hit by the pandemic are obviously earned income and payroll preparation tax. Like Matt spoke to the job market. We do anticipate seeing a rebound in jobs. However, in certain industries, like the service industries, we do anticipate seeing a permanent reduction in those jobs. Also, the things that are going to be hit are the amusement tax and the facility usage tax. That goes to the cancellation or postponement of concerts, along with professional sports seasons. And then lastly, another category that's going to be hit pretty hard is the parking tax and meter revenue. Obviously, we went through an area or a time period where the business districts were not open, people were not traveling as much, utilizing the meters. Parking enforcement was not out until recently, as of last month. And if we continue to regress back to that stage, those taxes are going to be impacted as well. We have worked extremely hard, since the administration has come on, to have healthy operating results and build our cash reserves to help reduce or limit the burden that the reserves would be felt for situations like this. We have certain limitations stipulated in city code where we cannot pass a budget if our general fund revenues are below 10% of our budgeted expenditures. Thankfully, I can say today that we don't have cash flow issues, meaning we will be able to make payroll, which is extremely important for us. That was not always the case. As we recently exited Act 47, there was a time when we were concerned about the upcoming 2, 3, or 4 payrolls. So we will be able to make those obligations as of now. However, my biggest concern with my office as we move into the budget process is where our beginning 2021 position will be and what it looks like, because that will determine how much we have to reduce in expenditures out of the budget. And then, our grants office, which also falls in our Department of OMB, is always on the lookout for opportunities for COVID reimbursements or help from the federal government or state government as well. We have applied for reimbursements up to this point for COVID-related expenses. However, all of those to now have been just for reimbursements for the preparation and execution of COVID-related plans. So that may change in the future, but as of now, our opportunities have been limited. We have already taken steps to reduce the expenditures in 2020 for the current year. However, we have not furloughed any employees. We implemented a modified hiring freeze. And I say modified only because we still need to deliver core services, especially now with the phase that we're in. And so if we freeze all of the unfilled positions, that could have unintended consequences, such as creating overtime, which would then increase expenditures. So we want to make, when we did the modified hiring freeze, we wanted to make sure that we protected ourselves from any unintended consequences such as those. We have already worked with departments to reduce non-essential expenditures by 10% for the years 2021 to 2025 in preparation of our budget process starting. I kind of framed it as a preseason to our budget process. And for those of you that don't know, our budget works on a fiscal year. So we go January to December. Our capital budget process is already underway. It has been underway for about 2 months now. And our operating budget process will be beginning next week. Non-essential expenditures, as part of that 10%, were identified as costs not associated with any project or contract already executed or planned. So a couple examples of some of the 10% cuts that we implemented already was a reduce in workforce training. Obviously, we have a travel ban for all of our employees, but as well as a reduction in office and operational supplies. A lot of the offices are working remotely, so we do think that we could reduce some of those budgeted expenditures for 2020 because there is not a need for those. We also worked with departments to identify some specific projects that we could delay or cancel for 2020. So this will only help reduce our current year expenditures on top of the other 10% expenditures moving forward, to help kind of prepare ourselves for what we anticipate, our revenues falling short of budget. The work isn't over though. We currently are refinancing outstanding debt to help achieve savings to help our cash position. The refinancing is for 2 to 4 debt issuances that we can take advantage of lower rates that are in the marketplace now and when they weren't originally there when the debt was issued. So that will help our cash position as well. Like I mentioned before, our capital budget budget process is underway now. And our operating budget process is set to begin next week. Just to give you an additional context for timeline, preliminary budgets, the preliminary mayor's budget is due in September, with the final budget due in November. At that point, the mayor turns the budget over to city council, where there are departmental hearings that are public or that are televised online, that will be televised online and on the city channel as well. So city council makes the final alterations to the budget, and we have ultimately passed one in December in preparation for January. So from now until then, our department will be meeting with other departments citywide to further reduce budgeted expenditures and fixed costs, because it's very hard to reduce a lot of the expenditures because our fixed costs are 75% of our overall budget, meaning 75% of the budget is dedicated to salaries and benefits. We're challenging departments to review all vacant positions to identify areas where we can eliminate positions without prohibiting their ability to deliver the core services. It's a really uncertain time for everyone at all levels. The main point I've been stressing to my department and other department directors is to remain flexible. The environment is changing rapidly, and with the recent surge in cases, it's possible that this will continue through the 3rd and 4th quarters, which is originally when everyone was hoping that things would begin to rebound. So nobody quite knows at this point when we will get past this. I'm now going to touch on some of the ways that the downturn in state revenues can affect the city. Obviously, it's something that we continue to keep a close eye on. The city's revenues that could be affected are things like our portion of the state sales tax, which Matt noted has been strong up until this point. However, we are concerned as well once the $600 stimulus for unemployment compensation goes away, what that effect will have what effect that will have on the state sales tax. Also would be things like liquid fuels, gasoline tax. Obviously, with everyone working remotely, gas prices have gone down. We receive money for a portion of that tax, and that goes into a dedicated special revenue fund that is used to pay for salt and winter operations for our Department of Public Works. So if we do not realize those revenues that we typically have had in the past couple of years, we may be forced to dedicate more city resources from our general fund to support those functions. We also apply for and receive any grants administered by the state yearly. So if there's a downturn in revenues, those grant opportunities may not be available to us. And grants are extremely important to us at the city. They help bridge the funding gap of projects so that we have funds to commit to other projects that are needed. We're always trying to get essentially the most bang for our buck and stretch our dollars as far as we can. And some of those grants that we have been awarded have been extremely helpful and critical to the services and the amenities that we deliver to the residents. They help fund playgrounds, walking trails, fleet vehicles, and large transportation projects from PennDOT. These are all important components to us, to the city, and we realize the critical nature of them. And we just want to do everything possible to enhance the experience for our residents. The next thing I want to talk on or speak to is what city services or public programs could be potentially affected by the downturn in revenues. Like I stated earlier, we're currently going through the process right now for the budgets of the 2021 fiscal year. And the financial picture is unfortunately very unclear. So we do not have any specific programs or services identified up until this point. However, as we go through, we really think that the second and third quarter will be a critical piece or pieces to help understand where our starting position for 2021 will be and what programs or services we will have to review and potentially cut. A lot of our revenues are already delayed. So once we started to work from home and once the region started to feel the effects of it, of the pandemic in March, we have now just started to see the effects of those revenue collections in June, April, and May. So that's why we identified the second and third quarter as being so critical. The possibility, much like the hiring freeze I spoke to earlier, you don't want to have any unintended consequences. So as we go through the budget process, we will be reviewing every single part of departmental budgets so that we can rethink strategies moving forward. But we have challenged other departments to also become kind of creative with certain things. So the Parks and Recreation Department has been trying to launch programs for kids online that would normally be done in parks. Our special events team has launched an online portal for farmers markets that were previously held in city parking lots. So while we may not identify any specific programs or services that need to be cut, it is a time to be creative to try to think of different strategies of how to reach city residents in this new environment that everybody's going through. So they may not all have to suffer. And finally, I want to talk on just a couple of things regarding programmatic spending and equality issues. This year, my office is running a pilot with program-based budgeting for specific departments. We're starting out small and hopefully moving to bigger citywide program-based budgeting initiatives. The two departments that we're going to start with this year is the Department of Innovation and Performance, which handles all of our IT citywide, as well as the Department of Human Resources and Civil Service. Again, my goal is to move all departments to this approach eventually because it helps make decisions or budget cuts or additions, whenever that may be, much easier. We can directly identify what areas of a department will be affected by the cutting of certain positions or programs. Oftentimes it's hard when you do blanket 10% budget cuts, excuse me, which are done throughout most cities, because you don't exactly know what programs or areas will be affected until it's already too late. We're also working hard on the equity front across the city. The mayor created the Office of Equity last year. That was previously the Bureau of Neighborhood Empowerment. So it was not a brand new office, but it did morph quite a bit. And that office is tasked with addressing and creating equitable strategies across the city. This includes youth and education, business inclusion, gender equity, amongst other things. There was a press release last week about our Equal Opportunity Review Commission approving over $23 million in contracts to minority and women-owned businesses in 2019, which was a 37% increase from 2018, and something we are very proud of. We have things in city code that state professional services contracts over $50,000 and construction contracts of over $250,000 require that Equal Opportunity Review Commission. So this is a measure to help ensure that we and our vendors are making an effort to include minority and women-owned businesses each and every day. We're also part of a Living Cities grant that focuses on improving local government's opportunities and creating more inclusion. As part of this plan, we've created and published a buying plan, which lays out potential projects, timelines, and dollar amounts of contracts that we anticipate for a year-long look-at period, not only for the city, but all of our authorities. And so the goal of that is to provide smaller businesses the opportunity to see what bids they may be eligible for over the next year to help prepare and collaborate with other businesses to develop competitive bids that meet the scope of services. We understand that some of the solicitations that we put out for vendors are large in nature, so we don't want to exclude any smaller businesses. They can partner with larger firms or partner with a bunch of other smaller firms to put in a competitive bid to potentially win our business. We've also implemented an electronic signature process as part of the Living Cities grant, which helps the timeliness to execute contracts with vendors. This helps reduce the overhead needed by the responding companies so that we can begin projects sooner and remit payments for services quicker. And finally, just to that, this has been that electronic signature process has been critical for us at the city with everything that the pandemic has brought and thrown in our lap to continue to execute contracts that are needed, especially once the construction in the region resumed last month. We originally started working remotely halfway through March, and we had to do so very rapidly. So without the electronic signature process, I'm unsure, how much of our business would be able to be executed up until this point. And so now that we have a process down and understand the process flows, we are working with departments to get them on board to implement it on a much more macro level citywide moving forward. And that's it for mine.
Okay, Kevin, thank you so much. We really appreciate you joining us and for that local insight. So there are some great questions coming in. I am now going to turn the next portion of the program over to Larry Helsham Jr., my colleague in government affairs at the Allegheny Conference, who's going to assist with the Q&A. Larry.
Thanks, Jen, and first and foremost, thank you so much, Matt and Kevin, for joining us today. So if you want to turn your camera on, we can sort of get our Q&A portion going. And as a reminder for folks watching, please feel free to put your question in our Q&A function, and we'll try and get to it as best as we can. My first question is for Matt. Obviously, the report was just released not too long ago, and we know the independent fiscal office is independent, but what have some of the reactions from the legislators in our Commonwealth been, and even the administration?
Yeah, well, as you could imagine, there's a lot of concern, and of course, the administration has published a certified estimate that's used for the purpose of the budget. So there is a little difference of opinion. We have a shortfall that's maybe $1 billion less than the administration. Still very large. So the administration is a little above 6 billion, and we're about 5 billion. And when I say shortfall, that's relative to the amount that we think we would have collected under normal conditions. So there is a lot of uncertainty, and that's one of the reasons you had the 5/12 budget that was passed in order to get a better handle on the revenue situation.
Right. Thank you for answering that question and talking about the sort of impacts of that, because I think that's important. I have another question for Kevin. We have heard from Matt. Very curious about the city and the potential budgetary impacts that state programs may have on the city's budget, and what you sort of see as happening with that front.
Yeah, I mean, I think, we just continue to monitor it closely. We understand how big of an impact it could have. And so once we, begin to understand at the state level what impacts it's going to have in the trickle down effect, we can start to adjust on our front to dedicate any resources that we may need, additional resources that we may not have needed in the past, to either continue those services or programs. But the hardest, part of the administration's cabinet has a dedicated employee that keeps an eye on the state and has a close contact with liaisons. So every day, every week is different with what we're hearing and what we're seeing. So it is something that gives us a lot of pause as well, that we're just going to have to remain on our toes to remain flexible with.
Right. I think that makes a ton of sense. We had a question from Adam, and Adam was curious is if the city or state's doing anything to facilitate anything with the election and sort of the budgetary aspects of that, and if that's going to be impacted at all.
Speaking for the state, I have to defer on that one, so I'll turn it over to Kevin if he's aware of any local issues.
No, I mean, not off the top of my head. I'd be happy to look into it and get back to Adam, I believe it was. The one thing that we at the city are looking at the federal government is just the upcoming potential stimuluses that could help local municipalities. I think that would be extremely helpful, whether it's another stimulus such as the unemployment compensation or a direct stimulus that could help bridge the gap of revenues, like Matt and I both spoke to with the recent HEROES Act.
Right.
Understanding that we are going into an election year, those are extremely important to understand. Not only, they are proposals at this point, but it's helpful to understand that so that we don't make any knee-jerk reactions too early and miss out on any opportunities and end up paying a little bit more than we may have needed in the long run once those decisions are made.
Thanks for answering that question. I have another question for Matt. Obviously, Kevin, you indicated there's a need to sort of remain flexible in terms of what this looks like, a need for sort of innovative approaches. Matt, what are you seeing in terms of other states and how they're addressing this issue? There's obviously discussion on federal stimulus, and an infusion of cash is important. You noted that almost $80 billion has come to Pennsylvania, but in the absence of new federal stimulus, have you seen other states talk about what they're planning on doing, in opportunities for us to sort of take what they're doing and replicate that here?
Yeah, very good question. I think most states, to my knowledge, are taking a very similar approach to Pennsylvania, and that is a wait and see. There's just so much uncertainty. So they are making the cutbacks where they can. There's some furloughs, wage freezes, things such as that. But the big question mark here is, will the federal government have another stimulus package where they're particularly targeting state and local governments and the additional UC piece? So I think a lot of the focus will be on state governments, and right now, until they understand what that will look like, I think most are in a holding pattern.
Yeah. And I do government affairs, obviously, with the chamber, and I focus on local and federal. And we've been sort of keeping an eye on the HEROES Act and what happens with that in the Senate. So I think the wait and see approach sort of makes sense. And Kevin, is that sort of the same case for the city? Are you looking at any other metros? And sort of what's your take on that too?
No, absolutely. It's 100% true for us as well. I was supposed to attend the GFOA annual conference this year, and it was actually moved to virtual with everything that's going on. And a lot of the sessions spoke to many different types of categories, but ultimately kind of came back to COVID and what other cities and authorities and towns are looking at. And it really is just a wait and see approach. I mean, it's hard to try to plan when you don't know what to plan for. And so that's why, like, I just keep saying remaining flexible, because at any given day, something such as the HEROES Act or the additional 600 unemployment compensation could help the economy in many different ways on many different fronts. And so what are originally identified as areas of concern may not end up being areas of concern, and instead you may have new areas of concern that you have to act quickly on once those decisions come down the pike.
No, thank you for answering that question, Kevin. I have another question for Matt. Obviously, there are some important programs that happen at the state that are really important for community development. A significant amount of projects in our state are funded by the RCAP program, and even the NAP program. So just curious on if you have any thoughts on how those programs may be impacted by this loss of revenue, and what the forecast for those programs may be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, two very important programs. I haven't heard or aware of any action that would be taken on either program in terms of revisiting them or funding reductions. So I think, just like everything heading into the fall, everything's open, everything's fair game. I think legislators will be looking at any and all possibilities in order to trim the budget if they need to. And we even now, I don't think we have an idea on what that might look like until these federal monies, we have an idea of how much is flowing into the state. So I hate to keep ducking that question, but it's very difficult to answer now.
No, yeah, I think you're completely correct. And it's okay to duck questions because there's a lot of uncertainty as we approach this. One thing that the Chamber has been focused on is the impact of workforce availability. Obviously, that's important. I think it was last week, the president sort of issued an executive order that curbs the amount of visas that would be issued. And so just curious on your thoughts on that and the forecast of that impact in the state revenue and obviously workforce availability. And that question's for Matt.
Yeah, I think currently in the short term, I'd be less concerned about it just because I think there'll be a little slack in the labor market, even on the higher end of the pay scale. We're seeing obviously disproportionately the layoffs and the furloughs are affecting folks on the lower end of the pay scale. So I do think there will be a lot of slack in the market at the lower end, even at the upper end where we have some of these visas that are for tech workers or doctors, those types of higher wage workers. I don't think it'll have major implications in the short term, but of course in the long term, and we think things will not recover, but we'll start approaching that in the middle of next year. Then I think you can see some constraints there where it might start to take effect.
Thanks, Matt. I have one sort of broad question, and if both of you can answer it, that'd be really good. What can the conference and sort of the employer community do to assist in ensuring our municipalities have the tools that they need to stay viable and stay successful? What do you see as the sort of business community's role in that? And either Matt or Kevin, whichever one.
I'll defer to Kevin to start. He might have more insights there on the local business, and so I'll let Kevin go.
Oh, yeah. I mean, as far as the local business, we have kicked around, potentially delaying the taxes for the local business to help liquidity issues. So, if we start to revert back, I think that would be critical to look into as far, for the lower end of the small business portion of the region, so that these mom and pop shops don't go out of business, because ultimately that's what makes the communities in the areas that we all live in run, and ultimately put us over the goal line. We always know that we do have our large corporations and large businesses that kind of pull their fair share of the weight, but when it comes to certain areas of opportunity and enhancing a certain lifestyle for our residents, the local smaller businesses are critical for us. So I would say the delay or for those taxes.
And the only thing I'd add to that, I think a few things are critical here in the short term. And one is just communicating the needs, the business needs, and where you're seeing it. Again, I'd stress that I think there's some major structural changes that this pandemic is bringing on, particularly at the lower end of the wage scale in certain sectors. And we're going to need retraining programs. We're going to need to help these folks out and get them to where the new demand is. So these retail sectors, the food service sectors, I do think the jobs training programs are critical. The other thing that's critical is short-term financing to make sure, as Kevin noted, that these smaller businesses have access to that are cash constrained until we get them by this critical period here in the third and fourth quarters.
Awesome. And Kevin, I know that the city has a number of partnerships. The URA just announced a program the other day. Where should people go, or business owners go, to access programs from the city? I know that we had a couple of questions along that line.
Yeah, I think the URA is a very, very good source. I know they have a lot of programs in place to help those things. I know we use a lot of the CDBG dollars and ESG funds that we allocate to the URA for those programs. So I would start there. Use the contacts that are listed on their website. They're always extremely helpful to outline all of the available programs for them.
Awesome, thank you. I think that wraps up sort of our questions for today. We will, if you have any questions, please feel free to contact us. We'll be sure to get those questions passed along to the city and the IFO. Thank you so much, Kevin and Matt. I'm going to pass it over to Jen, who's going to sort of close us out for the day.
Yeah, thank you, Larry. A big thank you to our guest presenters, Matt Knittel, Director of Pennsylvania's Independent Fiscal Office, and Kevin Pawlos, Director in the Office of Management and Budget for the City of Pittsburgh. Thank you also to all of the Allegheny Conference regional investors who participated today. We hope you found the program helpful and informative. And finally, especially like to thank our sponsors, Peoples, Giant Eagle, Highmark, and UPMC Health Plan for their support, which allows us to offer these critical programs. Final reminder that the Allegheny Conference has a COVID-19 response website, including our Ready Pittsburgh Reopening Toolbox, which we hope serves as a resource for businesses as our region continues with a safe and sustainable recovery. There's a link at the top of our homepage at AlleghenyConference.org. So be on the lookout for future invitations to our upcoming installments of our Response and Recovery webinar series. Thank you all for joining, and I hope you have a great Independence holiday. Thank you.